Imagine a group of people who work to destroy Italy because they claim Italy's origins are illegitimate. Imagine further that these people maintain that of all the countries in the world, only Italy doesn't deserve to exist. And then imagine that these people vigorously deny that they are anti-Italian. Would you believe them? Now substitute Israel for Italy, and you'll understand the dishonesty and absurdity of the argument that one could be anti-Zionist, that is, against the existence of a Jewish state, but not anti-Semitic. But that is precisely what anti-Zionists say. They argue that Israel's existence is illegitimate. They don't believe this of any other country in the world, no matter how bloody its origins. And then they get offended when they're accused of being anti-Semitic. How can they make this argument? First, they change the topic. They say it's unfair to charge those who merely criticize Israel with being anti-Semitic. But criticism of Israel is fine. Denying Israel's right to exist isn't. Anti-Zionism isn't criticism of Israel. Anti-Zionism is opposition to Israel's existence. Zionism is the name of the movement that advocates for the return of Jews to their historic homeland. Over the past 3,000 years, there were only two independent states located in what is called Israel. Both were Jewish states, and invaders destroyed both. No Arab or Muslim or any other country ever existed in that land, which was only named Palestine by the Romans to remove all memory of the Jewish state they destroyed in the year 70. Second, anti-Zionists claim they can't be anti-Jewish because Zionism has nothing to do with Judaism. That's equally false. It is the same as saying Italy has nothing to do with being Italian. Judaism has always consisted of three components: God, Torah, and Israel. If Israel isn't part of Judaism, neither is the Bible or God. Third, anti-Zionists claim that Judaism is only a religion, therefore Jews are only members of a religion, not a nation. But the Jews are called a nation more than 100 times in the Bible. That is why there can be irreligious, secular, and even atheist Jews, because Jews are not only a religion, they are also a people or a nation. There are no atheist Christians because Christianity is only a religion. Fourth, the anti-Zionists claim that Israel is illegitimate because it is racist. This is the fraudulent charge Israel haters and America haters make against two of the least racist societies in the world. Half of Israel's Jews are not even white, and anyone of any race or ethnicity can become a Jew. Plus, 1 of 5 Israelis isn't a Jew. And these Israeli citizens, mostly Arab Muslims, have the same rights as Jewish Israelis. As for Israel's control of the West Bank, that has nothing to do with race. Israel doesn't control the West Bank because Palestinians are of another race, but because Palestinians and their Arab allies tried to destroy Israel in 1967, and they lost the war. Palestinians have rejected offers to found their own state on 5 separate occasions since 1947. That's the only reason they don't have a state. And why have they always rejected building a Palestinian state? Because they have always been more interested in destroying the Jewish state. Finally, the anti-Zionists claim that Israel's origins are illegitimate. Of all the world's 200-plus countries, the only country anti-Zionists declare illegitimate is also the only Jewish one. That's pretty much all you need to know about their motives. Why, for example, don't they make this claim about Pakistan? In 1947, 9 months before the establishment of Israel, India was partitioned into a Muslim state, Pakistan, and a Hindu state, India. Unlike Israel, Pakistan had never existed before. Unlike Israel's founding, which created about 700,000 Jewish refugees from Arab lands and about 700,000 Arab refugees from what became Israel, the founding of Pakistan created about 7 million Muslim refugees from India and about 7 million Hindu refugees from Pakistan. And while the highest estimate of Arab deaths in the fighting that took place when Israel was established is 10,000, The number of deaths as a result of Pakistan's creation is around 1 million. So why is Israel's legitimacy challenged while Pakistan's isn't? There's only one answer. Israel is the one Jewish state. Of course, not all anti-Zionists hate all Jews. But if you seek to destroy Italy, you don't have to hate every Italian to be anti-Italian. If you seek to destroy the one Jewish state, you don't have to hate every Jew to be an anti-Semite. I'm Dennis Prager.
There is a widespread allegation, really a slander, that Israel is an apartheid state. That notion is simply wrong. It is inaccurate and it is malicious. And it will not help to promote peace and harmony in the Middle East. Its only purpose is to demonize Israel and to isolate her in an attempt to delegitimize Israel's existence. And because it is so inaccurate, it betrays the memory of those who suffered through a real apartheid. As a black South African who was born under apartheid in the administrative capital of South Africa, Pretoria, I know what apartheid is. I've experienced it. My parents experienced it. But having been to Israel on a number of occasions, I know that nothing is happening in that country that I've either seen or read that can be compared to apartheid in South Africa. Let's remember the major reason Nelson Mandela went to prison, why he was involved with the armed struggle. He was fighting for the right to vote, for the right to choose the leaders who believes in, for the right to move and travel freely, to live wherever one wants, to be educated, and to be admitted to the hospital or medical facility of your choice. All these things Mandela fought for because black people never enjoyed any of them in their very own country. For example, when I had to see a white doctor who was prepared to have black patients, I would have to go to a back room, a specially segregated room where black patients of white doctors went, who could never enter through the same door that was used by white people. Now compare that to Israel. A few years ago, a black pastor friend of mine went to Israel where he had an accident and had to be hospitalized. When he came back to South Africa, he said to as many people as he could that the people who are talking about apartheid in Israel are talking nonsense. When I was in that hospital in Israel, he tells people, on my right was sleeping a Jew, and on my left was a Palestinian Muslim. And in between that Palestinian Muslim and that Jew was this black South African. In private, the Palestinians he was with in the hospital said to him, this Israel is an apartheid state thing, is what politicians are saying. It is not what we are experiencing on the ground. We all need to recognize that those who say that what is happening in Israel is like apartheid South Africa are minimizing the suffering that black South Africans endured. They are taking the sting out of the pain that we suffered in South Africa. If South African apartheid was what people are seeing in Israel, there would never have been any need for an armed struggle. There would never have been any need for Nelson Mandela to go to prison because he would have all the rights Arabs in Israel have. There are judges in the Israel courts who are not Jewish in apartheid South Africa. You could never have had something like that. You have teachers who are not Jewish who are teaching Jewish children. These non-Jews in Israel have everything that we non-whites in apartheid South Africa never shared with white South Africans. Most South Africans know this. They know that to call Israel an apartheid state is false, that what we suffered in South Africa is not being suffered by anybody in Israel. But to those South Africans who believe these falsehoods about Israel, we say, go to Israel. Go and see for yourself. Tell us where you see Palestinians having to endure what we endured during apartheid. As a member of the South African Parliament, and in the name of millions of my fellow black citizens of that country, we know what apartheid really was. And I therefore ask those in the United States, Europe, and anywhere else in the world who charge Israel with practicing apartheid to please stop doing so. You are damaging the truth. You are damaging any chance for peace in the Middle East. And most of all, you are destroying the memory of the real apartheid. The charge that Israel is an apartheid state is a lie about the real Israel, and it is a lie about the real apartheid. I am Kenneth Mishwe, a member of the South African Parliament for Prager University.
They're turning social media against us, using it to influence our elections, spreading propaganda, disguising it as news. Pretty scary stuff. I'm not talking about Russia, that's amateur hour. The media organization I'm talking about operates right here in the USA, out in the open, legally. It has a large staff of on-air personalities, reporters, cameramen, and editors. It operates out of state-of-the-art studios in Washington, D.C., London, Rio, and half a dozen other major cities. It produces videos, news reports, and documentaries. It has tens of millions of social media followers. Their content is viewed and shared by countless young people across the Western world. In short, they're targeting us. CNN, right? Wrong. Fox News? Wrong again. The answer is AJ+. If you've spent time on social media, you've seen their stuff, I promise you. This isn't the work of a scrappy startup in Silicon Valley. AJ+ is bankrolled by the government of Qatar. Never heard of Qatar? Most people haven't. It's a tiny Persian Gulf state with lots of oil money. Billions of dollars they're not afraid to spend on causes they believe in. Causes like the terror group Hamas, which runs the Gaza Strip. Without billions from Qatar and its ally Iran, Hamas would blow away in the next desert sandstorm. But Hamas is only part of Qatar's terror portfolio. The Qatar government bankrolls the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda in Yemen and Syria, radical extremists in Libya, and Hezbollah in Lebanon. In other words, a rogues gallery of murderous Islamist terror groups. Qatar's propaganda arm is the Arab news service Al Jazeera, which it owns lock, stock, and America-hating, Israel-hating barrels. Al Jazeera made a splashy attempt to break into the US media market in 2013. They bought a cable franchise for $400 million from former Vice President Al Gore. They signed up some major American TV journalists and opened up shop in New York and Washington. But the effort failed. Americans just couldn't cozy up to the idea that a news network they had rightly associated with Osama bin Laden could be trusted. But Al Jazeera didn't disappear. They just rebranded into the much nicer sounding AJ+, and they concentrated their efforts on the internet in a market that didn't have a bin Laden fixation, or much connection to 9/11 at all. Young people. And they've been amazingly successful. Their productions are well-produced, slick, and left. In fact, they're so left that they make videos railing against leftist white women for being insufficiently sympathetic to leftist women of color, especially women of color who are gay or transgendered. It's hard to ignore the irony that a media operation fully funded by a country that oppresses women and gays makes this kind of content for an American audience. But the irony goes deeper. The young and hip presenters at AJ+ depict America as racist through and through, past and present. Black Lives Matter has no greater media ally than AJ+, nor do avowed socialists like Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. AJ+ jumped on her bandwagon early on, making a video in the summer of 2018 about then-candidate Ocasio-Cortez entitled Socialist Rising. Why, you might ask, would the government of a Middle Eastern country care about influencing young Americans? The answer is this. Anything that weakens the US is a victory for them and their radical form of Islam. If they can convince young Americans that the US is a bad place, young Americans are less likely to defend it, and less likely to support its efforts to fight Islamic terror. And if America is bad, then anyone it supports must also be bad. America supports Israel. Qatar, like its allies in the Iranian theocracy, wants Israel destroyed. So AJ+ turns out video after video, news report after news report, portraying the democratic, free liberal Israel as a repressive apartheid state, despite the fact that Muslims living in Israel have more rights, such as freedom of expression and the equality of women and gays, than Muslims living in Qatar. In AJ+'s world, Israel attacks their peaceful neighbors in Gaza for no good reason. No need to mention the rocket attacks randomly directed at Israeli civilians. Weaken America, weaken Israel. To Qatar, a few $1 billion for a few decades is a cheap price to pay if it can achieve those goals. But you don't have to play into their game. The next time you see an AJ Plus video or so-called news report, consider the source. Or better still, swipe left. I'm Raheem Kassam for Prager University.
We say that evil is dark, but this metaphor is imprecise. Evil is actually intensely bright, so painfully bright that people look away from it. Many even deny its existence. Why? Because once people acknowledge evil's existence, they know they have to confront it. And most people prefer not to confront evil. That is what led to World War II and the death of 55 million people. Many in the West denied the darkness of Nazism. They looked the other way when that evil could have been stopped and then appeased it as it became stronger. We are reliving 1938, the year that democratic Western nations assured a police state, the Nazi regime, that they would do nothing to prevent its expansion. That year, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain went to Munich to negotiate with Adolf Hitler. He left believing Hitler's promises of peace in exchange for Germany being allowed to annex large parts of Czechoslovakia. Upon returning to England, Chamberlain announced, "Peace for our time." The 2015 agreement between America, Europe, Russia, China, and Iran mirrors 1938. The Nazi regime was a police state. The Islamic Republic of Iran is a police state. The Nazis' greatest aim was to exterminate the Jews of Europe. Iran's greatest aim is to exterminate the Jewish state. The West dismissed Hitler as the Jews' problem. The West dismisses Iran as Israel's problem. Nazi Germany hated the West and its freedoms. The Islamic Republic of Iran hates the West and its freedoms. Germany sought to dominate Europe. Iran seeks to dominate the Middle East and the Muslim world. And just as Britain and France appeased Nazi Germany, the same two countries, along with the United States, have chosen to appease Iran. In fact, there's considerably less defense for the Iran agreement, which awards Iran $150 billion in currently frozen assets and the right to keep its nuclear program, than there was for the Munich Agreement. Prior to 1938, Hitler had not publicly proclaimed his aim to annihilate Europe's Jews. Yet Iran has been proclaiming its intention to annihilate the Jewish state for decades. There were no massive death to America demonstrations in Germany, as there regularly are in Iran. In 1938, Germany had not been responsible for terror around the world, as Iran is now. Nor was Germany responsible for the death of more than 1,000 Americans, as Iran has been in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Lebanon. The Neville Chamberlains of 2015 defend the agreement with Iran on two grounds: that the only alternative is war, and that this agreement has the capacity to bring Iran into the, quote, community of nations. The war argument is a falsehood for three reasons. First, the alternative to this agreement was continuing and tightening the sanctions that were weakening the Iranian regime and greatly diminishing its ability to fund terror groups around the world. Second, because the agreement so strengthens Iran, it makes war far more likely. When evil expansionist regimes get richer, they don't spend their wealth on building new hospitals. They expand. Third, Iran has been at war with America for decades. And whoever believes that the agreement will bring Iran into the, quote, community of nations betrays a breathtaking ignorance of the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime is composed of religious fanatics who are morally indistinguishable from ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, and all the other mass-murdering Islamist movements. The Iranian regime has executed more people than any country except China and killed more than 6,000 Iranians just for being homosexual. A woman in Iran is not allowed to leave the country without the permission of her husband. The Iranian regime repeatedly calls for the extermination of Israel. No other country in the world is committed to annihilating another country. Iran is already the world's greatest funder of terror organizations. Imagine what it will do with another $150 billion. Imagine what it will do with the removal of the current weapons and missile embargo. Imagine what it will do with its intact nuclear infrastructure. This deal allows all three. Very few people have a chance to do something about the greatest evil of their time. When it votes on this agreement, the American Congress has that chance. I'm Dennis Prager.
Why are so many people with so many different perspectives, from the Prime Minister of Israel to the King of Saudi Arabia, so worried that Iran might build a deliverable nuclear weapon? Or, to put it even more simply, why do we have to stop Iran from getting the bomb? The reason is painfully obvious. They might actually use it. France has nuclear weapons. So does the United Kingdom. But nobody worries that they will use them. It's not nuclear weapons that are the problem. It's who has them and what they might do with them. We do not worship Iran, we worship Allah, said Iranian leader Ayatollah Khomeini in 1980. I say, let this land burn. I say, let this land go up in smoke, provided Islam remains triumphant in the rest of the world. A militant nation that does not fear its own destruction is a sure threat to its enemies. And that threat is taken to a whole new level if the militant nation arms itself with nuclear weapons. Who are the enemies of the Islamic Republic of Iran? There are three. The first enemy of Iran is the United States of America. A common slogan chanted by Iranians at public rallies is "Death to America." But it's not just a slogan. Iran has been committing actual acts of war against what it calls the Great Satan for over 3 decades. There was Iran's seizure of the US Embassy in Tehran in 1979, the 1983 bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut that killed 241 American servicemen, and the 1996 Khobar Towers bombing in Saudi Arabia that killed another 19 Americans. Not to mention the war in Iraq, during which Iran did little to disguise the fact that it supplied anti-American militias with sophisticated, armor-piercing munitions responsible for the maiming and death of hundreds of US soldiers. A nuclear Iran could greatly expand its efforts to harm American interests, secure in the knowledge that its possession of nuclear weapons would make any military retaliation extremely unlikely. And over time, and not much time, a nuclear Iran could develop the sort of intercontinental ballistic missiles that would bring American and European cities within range of its weapons. A second enemy of Iran, which is a Shiite Muslim nation, are the Sunni Muslim nations of the Middle East. An Iranian bomb would instantly spark a nuclear arms race in the region, as Arab states, nearly all of which have majority Sunni populations, move to defend themselves against aggression from Iran. As these regimes and dictatorships race to become nuclear powers, the chances that nuclear weapons might be used, either directly or through terrorist proxies, grow exponentially. And the third and ultimate enemy of Iran is Israel. Only around 1,000 miles separate the Islamic Republic from the Jewish state. Iranian leaders have called Israel a rabid dog, a cancerous tumor that needs to be cut away, and have called publicly and repeatedly for Israel's annihilation. They wage a continuous terrorist war against Israel through their proxies, Hezbollah and Hamas. Former Iranian President Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, a man often described as a moderate and a pragmatist in the Western press, articulated the Iranian position this way. If one day the Islamic world is also equipped with weapons like those that Israel possesses now, then the imperialist strategy will reach a standstill because the use of even one nuclear bomb inside Israel will destroy everything. However, one bomb will only harm the Islamic world. He's right. That's why the civilized and sensible leaders of the world cannot allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons. Because once the Iranians do, they will pose a severe threat to the security of America and Europe, spark a regional arms race that could see the world's worst players acquire the world's worst weapons, and threaten the Jews with extermination for the second time in a century. Or, to put it more simply, Iran cannot be allowed to get the bomb because they might actually use it. I'm Brett Stevens.
How do you respond to people who excel you in invention, creativity, and wealth? Do you envy them? Do you feel their success somehow diminishes you? Or do you admire what they've achieved and try to emulate it? These questions sum up what I call the Israel test. In the 1880s, European Jews settled in Mandate Palestine and wrought an agricultural miracle in that desolate territory, then sparsely populated by a few score thousand Jews and a couple 100,000 Arabs. The Jewish settlers drained malarial swamps, leached salt from the soils, terraced the barren hills, and planted millions of trees. They massively expanded the capacity of the land and enabled it to support a substantial Arab population. In the 2 decades between 1921 and 1943, Jews quadrupled the number of enterprises, multiplied the number of jobs by a factor of 10, and increased the level of capital investment 100-fold. Far from displacing Arabs, they provided the capital for a major expansion of Arab farms and enabled a 7-fold rise in Arab population by 1948 to a level of 1.35 million, the largest in the long history of Palestine. In other words, the Arabs came to what would soon be the state of Israel because of the Jews. By comparison, Transjordan, now known as Jordan, with the same geological endowment and 4 times the land, but no Jews, was able to sustain a population density only 1/10 of the population density of Palestine. Crucial to Israel's accomplishments were world-leading technological advances in the recovery of water through desalination, drip irrigation, and sewage recycling. Over the past 50 years, Israel has increased its population 10-fold, its agricultural production 16-fold, and its industrial production 50-fold, while actually reducing net water consumption by 10% since 1948. This huge expansion of effective water resources enabled the land to support not only more Jews, but also millions more Arabs. Today, the state of Israel, with its astonishing achievements in computer science and other high-tech fields, distills both the genius of the Jews and the misdirected anger of the failed states that surround her. The great divide in the Middle East is not between Arab and Jew, but between admiration of achievement, along with the desire to replicate it, and envy, accompanied by violent resentment. People who admire success, who pass the Israel test, tend to be wealthy and peaceful. People who resent achievement, who fail the Israel test, tend to become poor and violent. So again, how do you respond to people who excel you in invention, creativity, and wealth? Do you envy them? Do you feel their success somehow diminishes you? Or do you admire what they've achieved and try to emulate it? The Israel test is the central divide in the world today. How you answer it as an individual, and ultimately how we answer it as a nation, is a test of our own will to triumph over enemies who hate us as they hate Israel for what is best within us. I'm George Gilder, a non-Jew who has passed the Israel test for Prager University.
In the judo competition of the 2016 Olympics in Brazil, an Israeli heavyweight judo fighter named Or Sasson defeated his Egyptian opponent, Islam El-Shahabi, in a first-round match. The Egyptian then refused to shake the Israeli's extended hand, earning boos from the crowd. If you want the short answer for why the Arab world is sliding into the abyss, look no further than this little incident. It illustrates how hatred of Israel and Jews corrupts every element of Arab society. You won't find this explanation for the Arab world's decline among journalists and academics. They reflexively blame the usual suspects: the legacy of colonialism, unemployed youth, the Sunni-Shia sectarian divide, and every other politically correct excuse they can think of. For them, hatred of Israel is treated like sand in Arabia, just part of the landscape. Yet the fact remains that over the past 70 years, the Arab world expelled virtually all of its Jews, some 900,000 people, while holding on to its hatred of them. Over time, the result proved fatal: a combination of lost human capital, expensive wars against Israel, and an intellectual life perverted by conspiracy theories and a perpetual search for scapegoats. The Arab world's problems are a problem of an Arab mindset, and the name of that problem is anti-Semitism. As a historical phenomenon, this is not unique. Historian Paul Johnson has noted that wherever anti-Semitism took hold, social and political decline almost inevitably followed. Just a few examples. Spain expelled its Jews in 1492. The effect, Johnson noted, was to deprive Spain and its colonies of a class already notable for the astute handling of finance. In Tsarist Russia, the adoption of numerous anti-Semitic laws ultimately weakened and corrupted the entire Russian government. These laws also led to mass Jewish emigration, resulting in a breathtaking loss of intellectual and human capital. Germany might well have won the race for an atomic bomb if Hitler hadn't sent Jewish scientists like Albert Einstein and Edward Teller into exile in the US. These patterns were replicated in the Arab world. Contrary to myth, the cause was not the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. There were bloody anti-Jewish pogroms in Palestine in 1929, Iraq in 1941, and Libya in 1945. Nor is it accurate to blame Israel for fueling anti-Semitism by refusing to trade land for peace. Among Egyptians, hatred of Israel barely abated after Prime Minister Menachem Begin returned the entire Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. And among Palestinians, anti-Semitism became markedly worse during the years of the Oslo peace process. Johnson called anti-Semitism a highly infectious disease capable of overwhelming intellectuals and simpletons alike. Its potency, he noted, lies in transforming a personal and instinctive irrationalism into a political and systematic one. For the Jew hater, every crime has the same culprit and every problem has the same solution. Anti-Semitism makes the world seem simple. In doing so, it condemns the anti-Semite to a permanent darkness. Today, there is no great university in the Arab world, no serious scientific research, stunted literary culture. In 2015, the U.S. Patent Office reported 3,804 patents from Israel, as compared with 30 from Egypt, the largest Arab country. Hatred of Israel and Jews has also deprived the Arab world of both the resources and the example of its neighbor. Israel quietly supplies water to Jordan, helping to ease the burden of Syrian refugees, and quietly provides surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities to Egypt to fight ISIS in the Sinai. But this is largely unknown among Arabs, for whom the only permissible image of Israel is an Israeli soldier in riot gear abusing a Palestinian. Successful nations make a point of trying to learn from their neighbors. The Arab world has been taught over generations only to hate theirs. This may be starting to change. Recently, the Arab world has been forced to face up to its own failings in ways it cannot easily blame on Israel. The change can be seen in the budding rapprochement between Jerusalem and Cairo, Riyadh, and Abu Dhabi. But that's not enough. So long as an Arab athlete can't pay his Israeli opposite the courtesy of a handshake, the disease of the Arab mind and the misfortunes of its world will continue. For Israel, this is a pity. For the Arabs, it's a calamity. I'm Brett Stevens.
Is Israel's policy of building civilian communities in the area known as the West Bank the reason there is no permanent peace between Israel and the Palestinians? The answer to that question, despite all the sound and fury regarding the so-called settlement issue, is no. The Israeli settlements in the West Bank are not the major barrier to a peace agreement. A little historical context will make this clear. For 2 decades, before June of 1967, the West Bank, including much of Jerusalem, was controlled by Jordan. During that time, a time when Israel did not have a single settlement, there were numerous Palestinian terror attacks against the nation-state of the Jewish people. In other words, Palestinians committed terror attacks against Israel when there were no settlements. And they committed terror attacks against Israel when there were settlements. If Israel were to pull out of every single settlement in the West Bank tomorrow, it's unlikely that anything much would change. In fact, if history is any indicator, Israel could be worse off. In 2005, Israel abandoned every single community, every house, every farm, every structure it had built in the Gaza Strip. How did the Palestinians of Gaza react? They launched thousands of rockets and numerous other terror attacks against the nation-state of the Jewish people. The attacks continue to this very day. And every year, the range of these rockets get longer and their payloads more lethal. Only a very sophisticated Israeli anti-missile defense keeps the country secure. Can you blame Israel for not wanting to risk a 2-front rocket war? But Israel has no right to be in the West Bank at all, many say. So permit me, a law professor at Harvard, to say that on the basis of international law, this position is incorrect. Military occupations are clearly permitted under international law following an aggressive attack by a neighboring state. Jordan, Israel's neighbor to the east, attacked Israel in 1967, despite Israel's repeated efforts to keep Jordan out of the Six-Day War. In defending itself against Jordan, Israel captured the West Bank and the eastern part of Jerusalem. Under international law, until a meaningful peace is achieved and all terrorism against it ceases, Israel has every right to retain military control over this area. Since no peace treaty has been reached and the terrorism continues with new attacks threatened almost daily, Israel is under no legal obligation to leave. Given the danger that Israel would be putting itself in if it did leave the West Bank, exposing its major cities and international airport to rocket attacks, it would be irresponsible to do so, which is why Israel is still there. Nevertheless, I fully acknowledge that a military occupation is significantly different, both as a matter of law and politics, from building civilian settlements, even in a territory that is legitimately subject to a military occupation. That's why I have long opposed the building of settlements in the West Bank. I believe it has caused resentment and has given enemies of Israel an excuse to attack the legitimacy of the occupation in general. It is also why I have always supported Israel's efforts to exchange land for peace, as it has done on multiple occasions over the last few decades. So while the settlements may have contributed to the difficulty of making peace, it has not been the major barrier that Israel's enemies claim it to be. It is not the reason there has been no peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. The reason has always been and remains the unwillingness of Palestinian leaders, and according to Palestinian polls, much of the Palestinian population, to recognize Israel's right to exist as the nation-state of the Jewish people. Until and unless the Palestinian leadership and the Palestinian people acknowledge that the state of Israel has the right to be free from military assault, from terrorism, from rocket attacks, and from diplomatic warfare, there will be no resolution to the Middle East dispute. If these conditions, which must be the basis of any two-state solution, meaning a nation-state for the Jewish people and a Palestinian state, are met, the occupation will end, the settlement issue will be resolved, and the blessings of a mutual peace will finally be achieved. I'm Alan Dershowitz, professor of law at Harvard University for PragerU University.
Why would someone who lives in Ecuador, that's me, be preoccupied with Israel? The countries are separated by 2 continents and an ocean. Nothing that happens in Tel Aviv has much, if any, effect on what happens to me in Cuenca. Except for this, I always want to know the truth about things. And I hate lies. And there are more lies told about Israel than about any place in the world. I have come to realize that if you believe lies about Israel, you will believe lies about almost anything. And if you know the truth about Israel, you're likely to think straight about most things. In other words, Israel is a kind of truth test. Fail this test and you've fallen into a fantasy world of untruth, a funhouse mirror of the real world. That's a pretty bold statement, I know, but I stand by it, and I'm not even Jewish. In fact, only about 1,000 Jews live in the entire country of Ecuador. So, how did Israel even get on my radar, you might ask? That's easy. Israel is very hard to ignore, no matter where you live. Did you ever meet someone who didn't have an opinion about the Jewish state? So, sometime during my high school years, Israel got my attention, and I started to do some research. At first I thought, wow, this is a complex issue. Was Israel the victim or the aggressor in the Middle East? Did it oppress its minority population, or was it a bastion of civil rights? Was it a colonizer of Palestinian land, or did it have legitimate claim to that land? Why did the United Nations pass resolution after resolution condemning Israel, but say nothing about Syria or North Korea? Why did Israel's neighbors pledge themselves to its utter destruction? All this attention focused on a country you have to squint to see on a globe. A country 1/10 the size of my own and with 1/2 the population. It was all very confusing, so I pushed on. And the more research I did, the clearer the picture became. Israel has free speech, a free press, and independent courts. It has open and fair elections. Its neighbors don't. Women have full rights and are active in every profession, including the military. That's not true of any of its neighbors. Neither is this. Tel Aviv hosts one of the largest gay pride parades in the world, and the only one in the Middle East. 1/5 of Israel's citizens are Arab Muslims. In fact, they have their own political party. The holy sites of all religions are fully protected within its borders. Can't say that about its neighbors. More research led to even more revelations. Israel has repeatedly offered the Palestinians their own state, and every time, those efforts were rejected. Why? For one simple reason. The Palestinians have never accepted Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. And the wall Israel built to separate themselves from the Palestinians, the wall most of the world condemns, the only reason the Israelis built it was to stop waves of suicide bombings. It worked. The bombings stopped. This stuff isn't hard to find out, nor was it hard to find out, despite the lack of Western media coverage, how many Syrians fled to Israel during the Syrian civil war to have their injuries treated and lives saved in Israeli hospitals. And then I realized that Israel is like a North Star of truth, a way to set your moral compass. If you can't locate this star, you're guaranteed to get lost in a sea of lies. How many rockets does Hamas have to launch? How many times does Iran have to threaten to blow Israel off the face of the earth before this becomes clear to you? Yes, life is complicated. As young as I am, I know that. There are shades of gray, but some things are pretty close to black and white. They just are. Why anyone who values freedom and democracy wouldn't wish Israel well, wouldn't be willing to take its side when it's threatened? I find hard to understand. I guess not everyone is interested in truth. Well, I am, which is why Israel means so much to me, even in Ecuador. I'm Sebastián Ceballos for Prager University.
Is the world going into a water crisis? It certainly seems that way. The U.S. government predicts that by 2025, 60% of the world's landmass and 40 of our 50 U.S. states will experience water shortages, some of them extreme. The U.S. intelligence community sees worldwide water shortages as a major national security risk. Water scarcity helped trigger the Syrian civil war and has been a key reason why Africans have migrated in large numbers to Europe. More of this can be expected. But there is cause for optimism, and it comes from a very unlikely place, a country in the middle of a desert. That country is Israel. Compelled by necessity and powered by remarkable technological innovations, Israel has become the world's water superpower. By reusing wastewater, by making desalination affordable, by rethinking irrigation, and by developing an array of sophisticated water conservation techniques, Israel not only has a sufficiency of water, but an abundance of it. What Israel has done, other nations can do too, including its Mideast neighbors. And while it's a lot to hope for, cooperation on water issues could become the basis for cooperation on other issues as well. For Israel, an obsession with water is not new. The word water appears 600 times in the Hebrew Bible. For over 2,000 years, daily prayers for rain in the land of Israel have been a part of traditional Jewish ritual. For the founders of the modern state of Israel, water was not only a daily concern, but a paramount question of future survival. Vast quantities of water would be needed for the millions of immigrants who would make their way to the new country. Without plenty of water, economic growth would be impossible. But where was the water going to come from? It was a daunting challenge, but one which Israel overcame. Today, while other nations, even ones with far more natural water resources, struggle with water management, Israel has a surplus of usable water. The desert, as Israel's founders dreamed, is blooming. Not only does the country supply its own population with an array of fruits and vegetables, but it exports billions of dollars worth of produce to nations around the world. So how does a small country with little annual rainfall, with only one freshwater lake, and with no major rivers do this? It begins with a nothing wasted attitude that extends from the government to private industry to farming to consumers. Israel charges its citizens the market price for water, no subsidies. You can have as much water as you want, but you have to pay for it. And when you pay for something, you tend to be more careful with how you use it. This also extends to the nation's infrastructure. In virtually every country, massive amounts of water are wasted every year in leaky pipes. Israel has developed technology that tells it when and where a pipe is leaking so that it can be fixed immediately. This not only saves water, but it saves homeowners and industry money on their water bills. The biggest user of water in Israel and everywhere is agriculture. To get maximum use of its water, Israel developed the revolutionary farming technique known as drip irrigation, the process of applying micro amounts of water to individual plants at their roots. This is much more water efficient than the traditional method, still widely used around the world, of flood irrigation, flooding fields with water. Israeli scientists have also developed drought-resistant crops that need less water to grow. Sewage is usually thought of as a nuisance, but in Israel it is now a highly valuable resource. Israel takes nearly all of its sewage, treats it to an ultra-pure level, and then reuses it in agriculture. No other country utilizes sewage as comprehensively as does Israel. Israel has also pioneered the use of desalination, turning seawater into drinking water. Once it was thought to be prohibitively expensive, no longer. Israel built 5 giant desalination plants along its Mediterranean coast that together provide the equivalent of 80% of the water piped into Israeli homes. Putting all of these practices and techniques together, Israel has grown into a water superpower as well as a global center of water innovation. As the world grows drier and thirstier, Those who want solutions will look to a little country in the middle of a desert for answers. Israel is ready with them. I'm Seth Siegel for Prager University.
There are 193 countries in the United Nations today. Of these, one has been singled out as an especially egregious offender of the organization's mandate to preserve and enhance human freedom and tolerance. Can you guess which it is? It has about 7 million citizens, of whom a fifth are Arab. The government is vibrantly democratic, its press wide open, and religious freedom fully respected. Women have equal rights and gays live openly. The answer is Israel. Here are some facts. 38% of all the resolutions of the United Nations Human Rights Council, the UN's top human rights body, that are critical of specific countries have been directed at Israel alone. The Council has a permanent agenda that governs every regular session. This agenda is composed of 10 items, one of which is always reserved for criticizing Israel. Between 2006, when the Council was created, and 2012, it published 48 reports condemning Israel. During that same period, there were 9 reports on Syria's mass killings and torture of its own citizens, 3 on Iran's genocide-threatening regime, and not one on, for example, China, which denies more than 1 billion people elementary freedoms. I could go on, but I think you get the idea. So we are faced with a choice. Either there's something very wrong with Israel that I'm not telling you about, or there's something very wrong with the United Nations that you should know about. Let's look into the history of both. First, Israel. Ever since its establishment, voted for by the United Nations, by the way, in 1948, Israel has had to fight its neighbors solely in order to survive. It has endured innumerable acts of terrorism, the most intense from 2000 to 2005, the so-called Second Intifada, in which children and other innocents were blown up in places like pizza parlors and buses and at weddings. It still suffers from rocket attacks against civilians from the Gaza Strip, which is controlled by a terror group, Hamas, whose stated reason for existence is to destroy Israel. Israel has developed a strong military and a web of security fences and walls to protect itself. Do these security measures cause hardships to people who must deal with this network? Yes, they do. Israel would like nothing better than to tear all these fences and walls down. But bitter experience informs it as to what would happen if it did. Is Israel a perfect country? Of course not. But it is one of the freest and most open societies in the world. That's Israel's history. Here's the UN's. In 1949, when the UN admitted Israel as a member state, the UN had 58 member countries and a clear democratic and pro-Western orientation. Today, the UN has 193 member countries, most of which are not even free. Among its many negative changes, the UN changed the principle of self-determination from a post-World War II, post-Holocaust human rights principle to a tool to wield against the West, especially against Israel. This reached its fullest expression at the notorious Durban Conference, held in South Africa in 2001. The Durban Conference was billed as a UN World Conference against racism and intolerance, but it turned into an orgy of anti-Israel and anti-Jew propaganda. Of all the bad actors in the world, the final Durban Declaration found one state guilty of racial discrimination. You guessed it, Israel. The Durban Declaration, however, remains to this day the centerpiece of the UN's allegedly anti-racism agenda. There's only one country in the world whose very legitimacy is questioned. Only one country that is openly threatened with annihilation. That country is Israel. And what has the United Nations done about it? Worse than nothing. It has itself become a global platform for anti-Semitism and the destruction of the Jewish state. I'm Ann Bayevsky, Director of the Touro Human Rights Institute for Prager University.
Visit Israel, and you'll be startled by how many colors you'll see. I don't mean the colors of the buildings or landscape. I mean the colors of the people. Black, white, olive, brown, and everything in between. Israel is a true United Nations. That's because Israel is a nation of refugees from everywhere. And more than half of them are from, are you ready? Arab countries. Over 850,000 Jews were expelled or fled from the Middle East and North Africa following the Arab countries' attack on Israel when it gained its independence in 1948. For over 2,000 years, these Jews had lived in the Arab countries of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, and in the Muslim but non-Arab countries such as Turkey and Iran. Today, they form over half of Israel's Jewish population. Many of these Jews from Middle Eastern lands look, well, just like other people from Middle Eastern lands, of darker complexion with dark hair. Other Jews migrated from North Africa. So why is their story so unfamiliar to most people? The most important reason is that they didn't remain refugees for long. But refugees they most certainly were. The vast majority forced to leave their homes, possessions, and businesses behind. In other words, they came to Israel with nothing. Some 650,000 of the Jews forced to flee North Africa and the Middle East became citizens of Israel. The other 200,000 fled to the United States and other Western countries. To give you an idea of how few Jews remain in Arab countries, consider these numbers. There were 150,000 Jews in Iraq in 1948. Today, there are less than 10. There were 140,000 Jews in Algeria. Today, there are less than 50. There were 75,000 Jews in Egypt. Today, less than 20. The pattern is the same across North Africa and the Middle East. Now contrast these forgotten Jewish refugees with the most celebrated refugees in the world, the Palestinians. How is it that the Jewish refugees are not even an afterthought, but the Palestinians are the longest lasting, most lavishly supported refugee population in the history of the world? The answer is purely political. After Israel gained its independence in May of 1948, the surrounding Arab nations attacked the new Jewish state. As a result, about 700,000 Arabs living in Israel fled. Many left because of the war, and many did because they were told by Arab leaders to leave the Jewish areas. The idea was that they would return once the Jews and their state had been destroyed. Khalid al-Azam, the Syrian prime minister in 1948 to 1949, admitted this Arab role in persuading Palestinians to leave. In his memoirs, he wrote, "Since 1948, we have been demanding the return of the refugees to their homes, but we ourselves are the ones who encouraged them to leave." That's how the Arab, later renamed Palestinian refugee crisis was created. In 1949, the United Nations formed UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for the Palestinian refugees, the largest and only long-term UN agency that was ever formed to deal with just one group of refugees. 70 years later, it still exists and still calls the Palestinians and their children and their grandchildren refugees. It has an annual budget of over $1 billion, funded mostly by the US and the European Union. How much did the Jewish refugees who were expelled from the Middle East and North Africa receive from the UN? How much did Israel receive to help toward their resettlement? How much does it receive today? The answer to all three questions is the same: zero. So the next time you hear someone talk about the Palestinian refugees, ask them why they never talk about the Jewish refugees. And the next time you hear people talk about Israel being settled by Europeans, ask them if they've ever seen an actual picture of Israelis in color. I'm Dumisani Washington of Christians United for Israel for Prager University.
Of all the countries that have come into existence in the last century, no country's birth certificate is more legitimate than that of Israel. One reason is that many of the men who founded the country, Theodor Herzl, Zeb Jabotinsky, David Ben-Gurion, Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Shamir, were either lawyers or had legal training. They were obsessed with making it legal. Unlike almost every other country, lawyers, not generals, were the midwives of Israel's birth, or more accurately, rebirth, since it had existed as an independent country twice before in history. Step by legal step, Israel moved legally toward nationhood, from the Balfour Declaration in 1917 to the San Remo Agreement in 1920, to the League of Nations Resolution in 1922, to the Anglo-American Convention on Palestine in 1924, to the partition of land ordained by the United Nations in 1947 into a nation-state for the Jewish people and an Arab state. Yet immediately upon its lawful establishment in 1948 as the nation-state of the Jewish people, Israel was illegally attacked by all the surrounding Arab states, as well as by elements of the local Arab population. In defending its right to exist during that war, Israel lost 1% of its population, including many civilians and Holocaust survivors. It also lost some of the land assigned to it by the United Nations. It captured other land from the aggressors that was originally assigned to the Arab state. The end result of that war against Israel was an armistice line that prevailed until 1967, when Israel was once again attacked by Jordan during Israel's war with Egypt and Syria. Between 1948 and 1967, despite the armistice, Arab terrorists continued to infiltrate Israeli borders and to injure and kill Israeli citizens. That was part of an official policy by the surrounding governments and by leaders of local Palestinian groups. All of it was in violation, obvious violation of international law. Following the establishment of Israel, a transfer of populations occurred. Several 100,000 Arabs who fled from Israel during the War of Independence were not allowed to return. Some had chosen to leave, assured by their Arab leaders that the fledgling country would not last a week. Others were forced to leave. At that time, approximately the same number of Jews were forced to leave Arab countries, another violation of international law, where they had lived for thousands of years. The difference was that Arab countries kept the Arabs who left Israel in refugee camps, where many of them still live more than half a century after leaving Israel. And Israel, on the other hand, fully integrated all the Jewish refugees from Arab countries into Israeli society, where many of their descendants now serve in the highest positions of Israeli life. Israel's establishment as the nation-state of the Jewish people by entirely lawful means is quite remarkable for several reasons. First, there is no country in the world that is as surrounded by hostile enemies as is Israel. It's been that way since 1948. Yet Israel sought the way of the pen rather than of the sword. It has needed the sword to survive, but its preference has always been for the pen. That is, for peaceful negotiations. Its peace treaty with Egypt in 1978, its peaceful abandonment of Gaza in 2005, and its many attempts to reach a peace agreement with the Palestinians are examples. Yet despite its entirely lawful origins, Israel is the only country in the world today whose origins, and therefore its very legitimacy, have been questioned by the General Assembly of the United Nations, by numerous member nations, and by many organizations that claim the mantle of human rights and the rule of law. Ironically, current attacks on Israel's legitimacy have taken the form of lawfare, the use of international law as a weapon. Any fair tribunal that judged Israel by universal standards would reject such attacks out of hand. But alas, international courts like the UN itself have been packed by those bitterly antagonistic to the nation-state of the Jewish people. For example, the misnamed International Court of Justice refuses to acknowledge that Israel, a country that deals with terror attacks and the threats of terror attacks on a regular basis, has any special security needs. As I've demonstrated, this phenomenon, questioning the very right of Israel to exist as the nation-state of the Jewish people, cannot be explained on legal grounds or on any other rational basis for that matter. So then, how can this worldwide attack on Israel alone be explained? In only one way. It is pure bigotry. And there's a word for this bigotry: anti-Semitism. If you have a better explanation for why the one country in the world whose right to exist is denied is also the one country that is the nation-state of the Jewish people, I ask you, what is it? I'm Alan Dershowitz, professor of law at Harvard University for PragerU University.